Hello, gratex. I'm going to snake Plisskenise this video on consciousness. I think it's got a lot of good points in it, so it should be worthwhile to do that, I think. For me at least, hopefully for everybody else. I for the rest of you who don't know, I've watched gratex for my entire stay on YouTube. When he used to have video games for his video. Turned out that was because he didn't have a webcam. I always liked that. I would watch those and kind of go back and forth focuses on the audio. I like that. I believe I tried to get Gratex to post his videos to a political blog. And anyway, that's a little bit of background. But I'm going to interleave myself with your video, Gratex. So here you go.
Right. So here's the problems I have with all these discussions. Okay. Wrapped up in the discussions is this archaic belief that there's some dualist soul, stroke ego, stroke aspect of a human being that is completely free from the material reality of the universe.
Well, for my part, I've tried to take it out of the discussion, right? You say it's wrapped up in the discussion, but I mean, I have tried to make clear that I am a non-dualist of the physicalist or materialist sort. My point is that there's still phenomena to explain with regard to this. And if you're non-dualist, then it has to come from, the one thing, the physical world that you're relying on. Now, I think I made a lot of videos about not believing in metaphysics and motivating that based on there can't be something separate from physics. Physics is everything that interacts with us. We define what seems and is physical for us through our own stream of perceptions, which we characterize as existence. Things that interact with that exist and so on, and we triangulate out into an incredibly large material world of things that exist or systems that exist. So I don't think I'm guilty of that, of confounding that in there. That's a boundary condition of mine. I'm looking for systems that explain this experience without relying on dualism, specifically, especially metaphysical dualism.
Right. And this mentality you can see in individual human beings. It's fed into them as children, and as they grow as children and develop, thoughts and internal dialogues based upon this fantastical supernatural belief. And then as adults they encounter more and more material reality, and both these sort of habitual thought processes fight each other, and that to me is the material basis of dualism. But obviously when you talk about things like willpower and consciousness and awareness, these things trigger these kind of thoughts in people, and that's why I don't like talking about them, because you're not going to go anywhere thinking about those fantasies. You're just not going to get any in-depth or adequate conversation out of people.
You're saying that talking about this, for example, even if I claim to do it in a non-dualist way, it's going to trigger these dualist fantasies that are programmed into these people. And it's like a minefield, and I shouldn't step on one of these mines. But I don't see it that way. I think they need to sort these issues out. It can't be left a minefield. The minefield has to be swept.
When you trigger these emotions with these words, okay, you're not going to get any self-reflection. All you're going to get is I am me. That's all you're going to get. right? When you say, "Oh, determinism," something, that's nonsense. If I decide to like hit you over the head with a bottle, then I've decided to do it. I will do it or I won't do it. Me. Well, who are you? And it's like I am me, and that's as far as you'll get with that conversation. Um, and I don't think it's really useful to talk about these words, these emotionally laden words, based upon a non-reflective, learned uh, belief structure arising from the culture. Um,
I don't see how you can call it a cultural creation. What I'm talking about, I'm talking about a first-person view of reality that I think that animals have. It is it the dog culture that gives this impression, or do you not believe that along with me? Um, Either way, even just for humans, I think that you can't call this a cultural illusion. This happens on an individual basis. I believe that if I was born on an island raised by uh, monkeys with that left before I could learn their culture or something, I don't know, raised by a vending machine, I don't think that would mean I didn't have a first person view of my subjective experiences. So I don't get it.
but when we're talking about these things anyway, when you say things like awareness, what is awareness? Define awareness. What do you mean by awareness? Being aware of the surroundings. Well, you can program a computer to be aware. It detects whether you've got a USB device plugged in.
See, great text. I feel this isn't quite fair because you talk about the awareness of a computer, and you want me not to equivocate between life and consciousness and awareness. You already made a distinction, as did others, between consciousness and awareness. I agree to use the word awareness. Now, it's as if you want me to move off that. You're going to say anything could be aware. No, just because something reacts to something, it's not the same as awareness. Okay, I drop something on the floor and it reacts to it and breaks doesn't mean it's aware of breaking. Okay, a computer is not aware, as far as we know, of that being put in. You want me not to equivocate between life and consciousness and stuff, but you are getting away then with ignoring the fact that we can tell the difference between living awareness and the way a living system works and the way a computer reacts. And if you're saying that the computer is indistinguishable, we know that's not true. Now, if you're saying that the computer gives us an idea of a system that might be as complete as a living system, true, but it's still a Turing machine, and I don't believe that living systems are limited to the physics of Turing machines. Okay, I don't believe that. And another thing is, if you're saying computers could be aware, because at one point I thought, well, the missing ingredient is just parallel computing. And if you're saying computers could be aware too, the computer is aware, then fine. I'm saying obviously the paramecium has something akin to a computer. It's doing more complicated computational work than our current computers. If all consciousness is just like that, then I would think the paramecium obviously do have it.
It's aware of whether there's a USB device plugged in or not. It doesn't have consciousness, though. You know, you can be aware of all these things going on in the periphery of your vision and the sound and smell and taste and so on, but not be consciously aware of them. So, again, consciousness and awareness are not some intertwined thing. You could be willing things, as all living things do. All living things will. If you're not being blown about by the wind, or swept away by the currents, or just rolling around the hills, based upon gravity, then you're willing, aren't you? You're willing. You're doing something that's beyond just the very, very primal base forces. Well, even not those ones.
Well, this brings up an interesting point because so you're saying that willing is more basic. It's the universal thing. There's no awareness. To me, what I don't see what willing even means if you're not willing in reaction to some awareness. but it is an interesting point.
Um, I mean, we may be completely constrained by those very, very, very basic forces. We just don't know. But there's nothing out there to suggest that consciousness is awareness, is will. There's nothing out there to suggest that. In fact, evidence kind of states that they're maybe not mutually exclusive, but certainly all three concepts or processes can function independently of the other.
I disagree with the idea that there's no evidence out there that they're related. I agree that they could happen independently. There's evidence that they're distinguishable. That's why we have three terms. But there is evidence that they're related, and I presented a one you could check yourself. You can videotape yourself taking a walk in the park or playing frisbee golf. Okay, you can know what it's like to have experienced that from the inside. You could see what it looks like to watch it from the third person perspective, and you can relate your intentionality, which is your will, and your first person awareness, and your consciousness of the whole episode. Yeah, that's evidence. Now, you could refute that evidence, but why would you just say, oh, there is no. Yeah, there is an evidence that there's a relation between these kinds of behaviors and these kinds of internal states. And we can establish it ourselves as individuals through this process, and we can extend it to the fact that you also look, when I have the videotape of you playing, it looks like me playing, more or less.
And
Okay.
therefore, there's something more fundamental going on here. That's, I mean, if we are willing unconsciously, then what does that mean for the discussion of free will?
Well, I think the ramification of that on free will is that other things are willing at that moment. For example, if there's no coherence on the macroscopic level of the brain, then the willpower, or so-called free will that now you're using that term, see, so am I supposed to scold you or what? But that that cell is having its own behavior experience like the paramecium. It's not collated with other neurons. So on the macroscopic level scale, for all I know, it's acting computationally or classically, let's say, just for example, and is not a part of our consciousness. That doesn't mean it doesn't have its own consciousness of, geez, I'm low on proteins, I'm hungry, or whatever.
You know, what's the ramifications of understanding that we unconsciously will things? What's the ramifications for that archaic discussion? And why are we not discussing the ramifications of that? Well, if we're willing when we're unconscious, then this whole idea of free will being the conscious self roaming throughout the universe is a completely defunct discussion to have. You know? And I think it's more important to have that as the foundation of any discussion about what will is, rather than just using the trigger words to try and...
Well, I'm asking the question of what are the ramifications? What are the ramifications of will and willing that these animals all have? And I think that the world is screwed up way more than it has to be. And if you... I mean, I've been involved in a lot of activism in politics, which I've talked about. And, for that to even make sense to have activism, there evidently is this more fundamental question of whether it's even possible to do anything, to even make a choice that could make the world be better. I think it's ironic people that make choices trying to make the world a better place from those choices, that any of them would argue there's no will. I don't get it.
Draw the horses to the water. So, I mean, this is my objection to your entire line of reasoning and discussion throughout the years on this subject, because you don't do enough to address the fact that this ego self will belief Although it's an experience and it feels real, it feels like, hey, I am deciding. I. It's not the I that's deciding. You know, it's
I've said this 1,000 times, but the only question is not is it free and blah blah blah. Is there willpower even? There is this phenomena and it has this first person perspective that's totally unexplained. We can explain why a ball drops at the speed it does much better than we can explain absolutely nothing practically. We're narrowing in on maybe getting an explanation, but it's still a phenomena. It's an illusion doesn't change that it's a phenomena. To get, I mean, you must understand that the fact that you said it's an illusion doesn't change that it's a phenomena and that it can be explained as well.
the brain that's deciding. It's not the I. The I is the little delusional fantasy, not the decision making fantasy. The decisions are being made by the brain. But it's the I that's the fantasy. That's what people like modernists dig. I can't think of anybody else just now. Has been trying to say to you people over the years.